So, let's talk about genre. When we talk about literature, not just in English courses or so forth, but in biblical studies courses, we talk about the genre or the type or the ilk or the kind of literature that we're dealing with. If you're familiar at all with the Bible, Psalms is heavily poetic, and there's a kind of style that goes with that. First and Second Samuel, where I've done a little bit more, writing about those books. We find that that's highly narrative in kind or type of literature. It's dominated by prose, and so when we talk in biblical studies about genre, it's very important because it helps us to think about what kind of material we're dealing with, and different kinds of material, different kinds of literature is to be interpreted in different ways. I don't interpret poetry the same way I interpret a news story, right? So I think that there shall never be anything as lovely as a tree, right? There's that poem by Robert Browning, if I remember. And we don't necessarily interpret that literally. We interpret poetry along the rules that guide the interpretation of poetry. The same way for a news story. If it says that a plane crashed on November 22nd of 1972, we don't interpret that poetically. We interpret that as a literal event, and then we might interpret what happened, why it happened, that kind of thing. But that is a different kind of literature that we're dealing with. So in the Bible, we have, here's some types, some kinds, some genres of literature. You have those broad categories of prose and poetry, but you have narrative, you have that kind of historical storytelling approach to either events or persons. You have legal material, like in the Torah. You have hymnic material in the Psalms. You have lament material in the Psalms. The Gospels look one way, while the epistles of Paul or of John or of Peter, for example, they look differently. Pardon me. The prophets, they have a kind of genre, and there are subgenres within each of these categories. Apocalyptic is a literature all its own, and you might look in the Bible anyway, you might look at the book of Daniel, or you might look at the book of Revelation. So part of the conversation is trying to nail down what Luke is. What do we mean when we say it's a gospel? And what are then the other gospels? How are they the same? How are they different? In this way, what we do in biblical studies is not all that dissimilar to what you do in the healthcare field or in any number of other fields. We're diagnosing. We're trying to get at through the use of a series of data, in this case literary data, we're trying to get at what this thing is. What do we mean when we say the gospel? Now, some would say, well, it's obviously good news, because the Greek word euangelion is translated as evangel, and this means good news. So Jesus preaches the gospel to the poor. Jesus preaches the euangelion, the good news announcement to the poor. Is that all there is to a gospel? Well, I mean, in some ways, I guess you could say that in broad categories. If you're a Christian like I am, the gospel is good news. But I'm talking about in a literary form. What is this gospel? How indebted do the gospel writers have to be for their history? Based on what we know about the book of Acts, when we compare Acts with Paul's letters, we know that Luke is pretty careful with Palestinian chronology. He's careful about Roman chronology. It does seem then that he's interested in setting out, even as he says, a kind of chronology and a kind of systematic approach to the events and the the narratives and the sayings or the sermons that Jesus or the apostles present to us. Matthew, for example, is more holistic in his thinking, and chronology is not as important. The arrangement of material is more important, it seems, in Matthew. John is a different kind of material altogether, still a gospel, but it's like each one of these gospels has their own character. Luke is a little bit more concerned about history, and some have even classified the Gospel of Luke, for example, as a kind of biography. And there's some evidence for that. It tells his story, that is Jesus' story, and then it tells the story of his disciples. Some have critiqued that it doesn't tell enough, or it tells in some senses too much to be classified as just a biography. So here are some of the questions that we try to get at. So when we think about this issue of gospel and the gospel genre, that can influence what we think about what the agenda is, or plural agendae, to be more to enunciate more clearly, are of this particular gospel. Is it solely about Jesus? Well, it is, but it's also about his followers, both in the gospel and in the book of Acts. Is the writer suggesting that the Christian community is foremost, or does the writer suggest that the Christian community is an offshoot of the Jewish community? Is the writer trying to make a point about the inclusion of the Gentiles? And that's a question that you see both in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts. When we consider all these things, then the idea of genre becomes a little bit more difficult to nail down when we think of what do we mean by a gospel, and what do we mean by each person's gospel, each writer's gospel. How do they deal with history? How do they approach that? Is chronology important? Is it not? How do they tell the story? How do they use vocabulary? These are the kinds of questions that we're interested in. And then when you have a story that's in one gospel, and then the same story in a second gospel, or even a third gospel, then you're asking, how does each one of these gospel writers tell the story differently, and how does that impact the way we think about genre? So let's move from there just for a moment and talk about literary structure. One of the ways that we could think about this great story in Luke Acts is that you start with the story of Jesus, and then you continue with the work of the apostles, the story of the apostles. In some ways, this fits really nicely with the way Luke introduces both of these books. He writes to Theophilus, a lover of God, Theo, God, Philos, lover. He writes to Theophilus in both cases, and he sets out what Jesus does in the Gospel of Luke. And then, as I mentioned in one of our previous talks, in Acts chapter 1, he says, the former account of, that I wrote to you, Theophilus, about everything that Jesus began to do and teach, implying that there was this kind of continuation. I kind of like that symmetry. I kind of like the way to think about that bookended approach. But there's more. One could look at the book of Luke and say, well, this is about the work of Jesus. And then in the book of Acts, this is about the work of the Spirit. So the Spirit, very much up close and personal, very important in the book of Luke. The Spirit rests on Jesus, but then in the book of Acts, the Spirit rests on the apostles as well. And so there's that continuation theme again, but these two Trinitarian persons in some ways having the preeminence. One, Jesus in Luke; two, the Spirit in the book of Acts. Another way to think about Luke and Acts and how these two books work together is you find in the book of Luke, we start with this Old Testament priesthood with Zechariah and Elizabeth, and so it's a very contained, insular society. And by the time we get to the book of Acts, we're in the capital of the known world in Rome. So there's this kind of literary yet geographical flow to Luke and Acts. These ideas, maybe they aren't important to you, but maybe they are. And they are the kinds of ideas that we in biblical studies think about as we try to get at meaning and digest data and genre and all of those things we've talked about already to get at what does the text mean and how then do I use it. All right, so we'll be back in just a little bit and we'll talk about that geographical structure a little bit more.